power systems, and also evaluating successful business models to expand electricity access. And her current focus is on the role that regional power pools play to overcome traditional barriers, such as increasing generating capacity, expanding access to electricity, and also protection from climate change effects. So we are extremely happy to have Amy share with us her knowledge and expertise. So without further ado, please help us welcome Amy Rose.
Thank you. Thanks for coming. So my goal is to not really get too technical and into kind of the technical weeds on this presentation. That being said, if you do have questions, feel free to interrupt me and we can go through those. But I'm going to be talking tonight about what I just finished, which is part of MIT's upcoming solar study, which is looking at the role that solar can play in developing countries. And I kind of focused on large-scale grid-connected solar. First, just to kind of set the stage, I wanted to go through what I think are some of the key energy challenges that you see in developing countries. And in this case, I'm mostly talking about electricity. The first is that you see very rapid demand growth. In developing countries, demand for electricity grows about 6% a year, compared to maybe 1% in OECD countries. You also have a large number of people who still lack access to electricity. So there's a huge latent demand from all those people who will hopefully be gaining access in the future. And for those who do have access, this has come up a few times already in this group, the service is often poor. A recent study by the World Bank showed that people in developing countries report an average of 10 outages a month from the grid, those outages lasting about 7 hours. So this is very disruptive if you want to have a business. And then you have this issue where the price of electricity is often very high, because either if the demand's not high enough in the country to justify building a huge plant, or the country can't finance a big plant, what happens is you get these incremental investments in expensive diesel generators. And so that raises the cost of electricity. Or on the other side, there's pressure to keep prices low, and so then the utility company can't make enough money to invest in better service. And then finally, something we've also talked about a little bit in this group, developing countries face this dual challenge that they really need to increase generating capacity, but also there's pressure, both internal, but also from big financing groups, to not increase greenhouse gas emissions. So the motivation to look at solar PV in Africa was driven by a couple of factors. The first is that when you look at IEA estimates of where they expect electricity access rates to be in the coming 10 to 20 years, everyone's expected to make progress except sub-Saharan Africa, where new access rates can't keep pace with population growth. But at the same time, Africa has this huge untapped resource in the form of solar energy. The other thing they have, probably as a relic from colonial times, a lot of African countries rely heavily on reservoir hydropower. So you see a lot of old reservoir hydro plants, which more recently are being touted as a possible enabling technology for solar, because hydro can be ramped up and down very quickly without the cost penalties of having to ramp up and down, say, a diesel generator. And then, contrary, in my opinion, to what was said at the launch event, solar is competitive with a lot of technologies that are being used in developing countries. Because outside of maybe South Africa, where they have coal, Nigeria, where they have gas, India, where they have coal, a lot of developing countries are burning diesel. And solar is competitive with that. And just to kind of emphasize this point, on your left is a plot of this is a range in blue of the global prices we're seeing for concentrated solar, solar PV, and diesel. And then these yellow lines are the global averages. So on average, solar technologies are already competitive with diesel. And then if you look at some, like out here, these are kind of the island nations where diesel is very expensive to get this fuel. Then you can have a lot of savings from solar. And there's a lot of diesel being burned. in 2010, 20% of delivered power came from either kerosene or some form of fuel oil plant. And in sub-Saharan Africa, over 28 countries get half of their generating capacity from some type of fuel oil plant. So there's a huge opportunity to displace this with something like solar. So for our study, we decided to look at Kenya as a case study. Kenya has a huge solar resource. Every day, about 200 times what they're using on the grid is coming into the country in the form of solar energy. In the last 10 years, they've averaged about 7% annual growth in demand. And they also heavily use leased and fixed kerosene and fuel oil plants. Last year, 38% of their delivered power came from some of these plants. Just to give you some perspective of what's happening in the country, these circles in green are the consumption centers. So most of the consumption is happening here in Nairobi, with some on the coast and then over by Lake Victoria. And then in red is generation. So most of generation is currently coming from hydro in the center of the country, and then some geothermal. And then this is how the government expects their system to look by 2030. So they plan to have a whole lot of geothermal, huge coal and more diesel capacity on the coast, which is going to require a new port and a lot of supporting infrastructure, a lot of wind up north, and then a huge interconnect with Ethiopia, which is going to require a big transmission line. So they have very ambitious plans, but you can see it's going to require a lot of supporting infrastructure. So what did we do? I built, it's called a unit commitment model, and this model looks at 1 year, one static year of the Kenyan system. It takes in all the technical requirements from all the plants, what are their ramp rates, how much does it cost to generate, how much fuel do they use, and it matches up for every hour of the year, how will you meet demand. So the output gives you every hour of the year, which plants were dispatched, how much did it cost. And I ended up looking at 2 years. I looked at 2012, which when I started the study was the current year. But then I wanted to look at a future year. And the reason I wanted to do this was because when I went to Kenya and I met with the utility companies and I met with the government and asked why they weren't considering solar, what they said was solar might make sense now, but in 5 years we're going to have a huge coal plant and we're going to have a huge geothermal capacity, and in 10 years we're going to have a nuclear plant. So it doesn't make sense for us to do solar now. So I wanted to look 5 years down the line and see if solar made sense. And then I ran a variety of scenarios. One, the base case with no solar on the system, just to see what things look like now. And then I ran 10 scenarios with varying increments of PV ranging from 100 megawatts up to 1,000. And I looked at how it affected operations, which plants were being dispatched, how were you having to operate the hydros in order to accommodate solar, and also the economic impacts. And the way I did this was I did not assign a cost to solar, because I wanted to use this model as a price discovery mechanism to figure out what the value of it was in the system. Alex?
I was just going to ask what peak load was on the system. Like, what's the relative impact of 1,000 megawatts on Kenya?
It's big. That would be like, I mean, their total generating capacity, which is coming up next, is like 1,600 megawatts. So that'd be huge. But I just wanted to do a really big range.
For your 2017 model, did you take into account the proposed power plants that they were suggesting?
Yeah, so that'll be on the next slide. You can see the different scenarios.
Sit down, sit down.
That's fine, yeah, feel free to interrupt. Any questions on the results? We can just okay, so what I wanted to do to figure out what the value of solar was is for every scenario, say I added 100 megawatts, see what the difference in cost was between the 100 megawatt scenario and no solar on the system. And that difference in cost will give you some amount in millions of dollars. And you can divide that by the capacity of the solar plant and figure out in dollars per watt how much is that plant worth. and then say you put in a 1 megawatt plant and you saved $1 million, that's $1 per watt. And then you can look at both the Kenyan feed-in tariff, but also plants that are being built other places and say, is that feasible? Can you build a plant for $1 per watt? And if not, then that means solar is not really economically viable. The scenarios. So 2012 peak load is about 1,200 megawatts. They're mostly using hydro, diesel with some geothermal. 2017, I ended up doing 3 different scenarios for 2017. And the reason why is because NP is their national plan. They're expecting demand to go from 1,200 to 3,200. And this would be their total capacity. It's just incredibly ambitious to get this coal plant in, all the new wind generators, and the interconnect with Ethiopia. All of this might happen, but I'm very skeptical that it's going to happen by 2017.
Amy, just a quick question, sorry. On the interconnect with Ethiopia, what type of power is being
It's
coming
hydro.
across? It's hydro.
Hydro from Ethiopia. So it's not really clear how that power purchase agreement is going to happen.
Okay.
There's a lot of uncertainty with all of these. So I made 2 other scenarios where I assume that peak demand is going to continue to grow at historic rates of 7%. And then I took out what I deem to be the riskiest plants, either because there's dispute about financing or power purchase agreements or supporting infrastructure. So I took out the coal, the wind, and the imports. And then I looked at what would happen if they're able to accomplish their plans for all the geothermal, such GOI. And then what if they only accomplish half of the new geothermal investments and they have to make up the rest with diesel, which historically is what happens. They have big plans, they accomplish about half of it, and then the rest has to be new diesel. Okay, results. Yes?
So right now, just looking at the numbers, it's reliable electricity because the demand is less than the generation.
It's not reliable. They have about 250 outages a year because they have very high losses. They also have a lot of vulnerability.
So over here, the generation is
This is,
the capacity, or
this is the capacity.
Sorry,
Something
don't worry
happens
about it.
upstairs.
Oh, okay. So this is their capacity, but if there's a drought or if there's a plant that goes down, then they don't have as much that they can generate. So they have a very narrow margin in reality.
What's the main reason, or what are some of the main reasons that natural gas doesn't show up on the picture?
Because they just discovered natural gas off the east coast of Africa in the last year, 2 years. I mean, it's relatively recent. They actually just found coal in northern Kenya in the last year or 2. But it's going to take years to really develop those resources. And with the natural gas, there's a big question of whether or not they should sell it or burn it themselves. They don't really have plans in the near future. With some of their new diesel plants, they're supposed to be built so that in 5 years they can switch to natural gas. Okay, so what happened? This is in 2012, and these plots in the back, this is a typical week, the generation profile for a typical week. So they have peak in the morning and then a peak every evening, sort of for 7 days. And the green is geothermal, the red is diesel, the blue is hydro. So on the top, this is the base case when you don't have any solar. Most of the power is being met by diesel and hydro. And then I just put, to represent what happens, 500 megawatts of solar. And then it's kind of hard to see which plants are being displaced from these plots. So if you look here, you can see during the day, solar is displacing a lot of diesel, but it's also displacing a lot of hydro. And that's because during the day, their hydro plants can hold back the water, and then in the evening, the hydros can run even higher and displace even more diesel during the evenings. So economically, what does that mean? If you look at that cost per watt value that I talked about. I evaluated that for different hydro scenarios, a dry year, a wet year, an average year, because their hydrology can vary quite a bit. What you see on the x-axis, this is the installed solar capacity from 100 up to 1,000 megawatts. And as you add more and more solar, the value decreases, which is pretty obvious because at first you're going to displace the most expensive plants. So that first 100 megawatts of solar is going to displace kerosene, which is really expensive. And then by the time you get here, you've displaced all the kerosene, and you start to displace something that's less expensive. So that added value of more solar is not there. And then just as a comparison as to if this $5 a watt or $3 a watt is feasible, I also plotted some comparisons with what revenues could you expect from the Kenyan feed-in tariff, which is 12 cents a kilowatt hour, which is, I think, too low. No plants that I know of have been built for that, but maybe. And then in India and South Africa, they actually are building plants for 15 cents and 20 cents a kilowatt hour. So they might be more reasonable estimates. And you can see, at least in the case of India, the value of that solar plant is above what you have to pay the plant investor up to about 700 megawatts. For South Africa, if you have to pay about 20 cents a kilowatt hour, then you could maybe do 100 megawatts, and it would be valuable to the system, if that makes sense. And this doesn't include costs like avoided greenhouse gases or diversifying your generation mix. Those might add other values.
Do those results account for the stochasticity that you expect with hydro or solar or the other generation types in your model?
So solar is deterministic in this case, which is a shortcoming of the model. Hydro, the way I dealt with stochasticity of hydro was I used 47 years of historic inflow data, and then I ran it for 47 different scenarios. And then based on the distribution of the inflows for all those years, I developed these categories of how do you characterize a dry year, an average year, and a wet year.
So those means or are those confidence bounds on
They're means. Yep. Okay.
And could you talk a little bit more about the cost structure? So when you were telling us about what you excluded from the cost structure and whether or not it makes economic sense, what are you actually covering? Because when you talk about building a PV plant, there's so many different costs that run into that. So what did you actually include?
So this is, that's a good question. This is a very kind of top level assessment. So these cost estimates are based solely on what are you saving from not burning fuel and not having, well, the O&M costs are kind of fixed, but and based on those savings alone, how much could you afford to build a solar plant for? And if they do intend to make a solar plant, then you're going to need much more sophisticated analysis than this. But the fact was, when I met with the utility companies, large-scale grid-connected solar was not even on the table. They weren't considering it. And they hadn't done any kind of top-level analysis when I asked them about it. So, yes?
I'm a bit, interested in the cost structure of how you build your solar projections. Because, for example, in developing countries, for example, in Nigeria, building a natural gas plant, somewhere else, when it was going to be done in Nigeria, they actually had to adjust for, bottlenecks, the lack of infrastructure and everything, and it came to about almost double the price. So, I'm not sure. Did you factor in all the additional costs that you may incur building this in the country?
So what I didn't factor in was like the need for a transmission line. This might impose more losses on the distribution system. That would be an excellent next step to try to figure out, can you kind of strategically place solar in such a way that you can avoid added transmission? If you were to say, what's the benefit of doing a huge solar plant without having a bunch of transmission, or their big coal plant on the coast with their transmission? That's a different cost trade-off, and the transmission network was not something I looked at. But it was, I wanted to get to it, but I didn't.
I'm just curious, who owns the dams? And is there anything like a requirement for how much they need to run or meet water needs as well?
So the dams are owned by Kengen, which is their quasi-state-owned utility. It's 80% owned by the government. And I talked to their hydrologist, and there are no minimum flow rates, which was, it made this easy, but for the people who live along the cascading reservoirs, that's definitely an issue. Is there another question?
Does Kengen own all the plants in Kenya?
No, they now have several IPPs, but none of them, there's 2 geothermal IPPs, independent power producers, and then maybe 4 or 5 who are either currently have or are about to build some kind of diesel plant, and then Agreco leases 2 diesel plants.
Is demand supply constrained? I mean, if you were to add, because you're sort of assuming
Yeah,
a
that's
fixed
the
amount of
question.
demand, and then you're optimizing capacity for that. But if is it investment that's limiting the amount of capacity can be added every year? If you could add more, would there be more demand? What?
I mean, so the first answer is I'm not sure. I think that if they were to have more capacity, then certainly demand would go up a little bit, but ultimately it's going to be limited by new connections. They need to connect more people. Because they have load shedding events, several every month, but they're not, I mean, the actual amount of load they have to shed isn't huge.
Yeah. Annual.
So, but yeah, I mean, it's kind of hard to tell. Is the capacity constrained nature of the system, is that what's changing people's behavior and their demand, or
Right.
which way is it
So
going?
yeah, we usually don't think about them that way, but
Yeah.
in this case, it
So
may be.
yeah, short answer is I'm not sure. Okay, so just to go through quickly the other scenarios and what we saw. In the national plan, if they're able to do all these huge projects, I say more power to them. Their costs are going to go down. Solar makes no economic sense in that case because solar would be displacing, by this point they plan to decommission the kerosene plants and get rid of all the leased diesel. So solar would be displacing coal and imported hydro and things that are cheaper. So you can see there's still like a little bit of diesel on the system that solar can displace, but that's a different fuel and it's a cheaper fuel. So, yes.
I think I missed this part of the explanation, but how do you go from feed-in tariff, which is dollars per megawatt hour, to dollars per watt? Is the amount of money during the lifetime of it?
It's, yeah, discounted rate. What could you, based on how many kilowatt hours, in other scenarios the solar actually gets curtailed, so you're not using that much of it. So how much of the solar that's being generated are they using? How much could they earn from that feed-in tariff over the lifetime of the plant?
Divided by the
Discounted for, yeah, and I assume 20-year lifetime. Yeah, I glossed over a lot of details. Okay, and just quickly, in the GOI scenario where they're building a whole lot of geothermal, if they're able to get all of it done, what you actually see is that this downward sloping curve is because the solar is getting curtailed. Geothermal is pretty inflexible. You can't ramp it up and down very quickly. But because their demand is their peak demand is in the evenings, you need all your geothermal in the evenings, so they can't ramp them down during the day. The hydros can only ramp so much, so you just have to curtail the solar. And again, it wouldn't make economic sense in that case. And then in the GeoLow scenario, which maybe I'm biased, but I think it might be the most realistic, where they're only able to build half as much as they plan, and then the rest they have to make up with more diesel. They have decommissioned, assuming that they've decommissioned the kerosene plants and the most expensive ones at this point, there's still quite a bit of diesel that you can displace with solar. And at rates of the Kenyan feed-in tariff, it might still make economic sense up to very high penetration levels. But then, when you get really high, above 600 megawatts, again, you start having to curtail the solar, and so that wouldn't make sense. That's clear. Okay. But more generally for other African countries, I think the characteristics that make solar an interesting option for Kenya, you see in a lot of other African countries. Kenya is actually quite blessed because they have this huge geothermal capacity that they can tap into. But outside of there, and maybe Tanzania, they don't have geothermal. And so for other countries, it might even make more sense and under a lot of different scenarios. Because across the continent, you have this great solar resource that's largely untapped. In addition, there's a lot of untapped hydro potential in Africa. And the World Bank, for better or for worse, is really starting to get excited about large hydro projects again. And from talks with some people in the energy sector, they're also starting to think about maybe coordinated investments to develop both solar and hydro together, which might make great sense. But also, as I discussed earlier, there's a lot of diesel being burned in Africa, so there's a huge economic potential to displace that with solar if you have something like hydro that can provide storage and can accommodate the intermittency. If you don't have hydro, then I don't think it would make sense because you have to somehow accommodate solar's intermittency.
So is the diesel grid connected?
Yeah.
I think in my understanding in India, a lot of diesel use is like decentralized, used as backup for power outages. Which I think is different in Africa.
I mean, they have that in Africa as well. As we've heard, a lot of people, because there's so many outages, have their own personal diesel generator for backup. But the ones I'm talking about are big 50 and 100 megawatt plants.
So of the total diesel use, how much percentage is grid connected versus?
I only looked at grid connected. I've tried to look at how much kind of off-grid personal use of diesel there is. And I mean, maybe someone else has recommendations, but I've found those numbers very hard to find. So I don't really know how much is being used.
Do you know the numbers off the top of your head of the percentage of plants that would be displaced by solar, the hydro versus diesel?
So you're not going to displace hydro with solar.
Okay.
Just economically, it doesn't make sense.
Okay.
There also might be some implementation issues because the plants are publicly owned, so there might be a big outcry about holding back hydro when the reservoirs are full and people see that and the government responds to the public, but that's kind of another issue.
So it's entirely diesel that's being displaced?
That would be the only thing that would make economic sense.
It's a good caveat.
Yeah, Vivek?
What do the numbers look like if you were to do a cents per kilowatt hour installation? Because I think most of the results were investment implications.
Yeah, dollars per watt. So it ranges between, in the current system, it went from like 25 cents a kilowatt hour down to about 11. But then those calculations get a little messy when you looked at some of the other scenarios where solar was getting curtailed, because they might get a high cents per kilowatt hour, but it's only 100 hours a year.
So the results then don't include any reliability premium?
No. I didn't get into any of those details. Yeah.
So did you present these results to like planners in Kenya, and did you change their minds so that they're considered solar now, or not? Like, why were they not convinced?
No, that's the perfect question. I have shared this with them, and kind of throughout the whole process, I was in contact with several people at the ministry and at the utilities. They did raise their feed-in tariff 1 cent. I don't think, yeah, that was on me.
Amy, that's great.
To be honest, this is probably not going to change their behavior. I think what's going to change how they view solar is the fact that South Africa just had a solar plant go online. Rwanda just got a solar plant that I think should be coming online soon. When they see these other countries who are able to, without increasing their costs, add grid-connected solar, I think that will change their mind. Their recent kind of 20-year planning study that came out in 2012 used prices from 2008 for solar. So when they compare the price of a 2008 solar plant with a coal plant, then of course they're not going to consider big solar. So I think it'll change, and I think Kenya will get a grid-connected solar plant, but I don't think it will be because of me, if we're honest. But yeah, I mean, they've been very, very cooperative, very receptive. I think I've been very fortunate to work with them.
So, I assume when you're calculating the dollar watt per watt equivalent, you're sort of assuming a static, like you're multiplying that year by 20 years, right? So like when you're doing your
At
scenario
a
for
discount rate of
2017.
5%.
Yeah, but the grid stays the same, so
Yeah.
the value of solar stays the same.
Yeah, so you're assuming that static year.
Yeah, so what I'm seeing from your results is that over time, assuming you could move towards a central station, system where you've got big coal, you've got big hydro, you've got geothermal, the value of solar erodes over time and over the life of the solar investment. So maybe they're not going to get to their national plan by 2017, that seems crazy, but
Yeah.
if they get there by 2020 or 2025 or whatever, that the later years of the solar value goes away.
That
Do you
would,
think that affects
that would be the case if you're building more plants and demand is staying static. If you're building your capacity out and demand is growing, then...
So if you're assuming you're capacity constrained to meet demand.
Yeah.
This is incremental.
What is the population grid connected right now?
25%, I don't know how many people are in Kenya?
Like 25%. And they plan to, do they have a grid extension plan as well?
Their plan is to hit 40% by 2030. You stepped in if I say something that's wrong. I think that's the numbers from their plan.
Okay, yeah, I was also going to, I'm just thinking that another area of opportunity would be for off-grid areas. So,
Yeah.
You could easily deploy solar technology in areas that are not connected to the grid. So, if, for example, you plot the cost of extending the grid to those areas, or the cost of implementing standalone solar implementations, I think there's also an opportunity.
Yeah, definitely. And so let me get to my last slide because that speaks to it perfectly. And that is that I looked at one kind of implementation of grid-connected electricity and one technology, which is solar PV. But there are so many different ways to apply just solar or apply all these different technologies to the diverse set of challenges. And I just wanted to share with you that part of my motivation for looking at energy access and development was from my experience as a Peace Corps volunteer in West Africa, where my husband and I were in a village without electricity access, without running water for 2 years. So this was our local transport. There was another bus, but it broke down a lot, to the nearest place with internet. This was our water filter, and that's what our water looked like until the rains came. This was a local restaurant. So we saw a lot of these challenges, and I felt like we kind of had a mini debate during the launch event on what's the value of a 60-watt panel, because soon people will just want more so that they can have a TV, and then they can have a fridge. And I would say we used a kerosene lantern for how long? 2 days? Something like that? And it was awful. The smoke was terrible. Kerosene's expensive. The lighting quality is poor. And we had a 60-watt panel, and it changed everything. We could see at night. In terms of safety, you're not breathing in smoke. You can see the bugs on the ground. The hut next to us burned down twice in 2 years. So this low-hanging fruit in terms of very simple solutions or off-grid solutions, and maybe they are temporary, because maybe people will only want lighting for so long before they want a TV. It's absolutely right. But they can make a big difference. And so, yes, I've kind of presented one technology and one application here, but I'm very excited about this group and about, in the coming weeks and months, hearing from all of you about all of your different takes and different approaches. So.
So it's just 6:15, so I think it would be great to, what we want to do generally is at the end leave 5 minutes for you guys to all network and talk to each other and sort of share ideas, I think as Amy has mentioned. But I think if we could pepper you with questions for about 5 more minutes, that would be great. So maybe right here, Yanni, could you speak up?
Yeah, I was just wondering what you think about this. I think the idea is in the developed countries, we're moving towards distributed generation to better support the grid, kind of grid resiliency. How would that change the thinking if we're kind of trying to leapfrog in developing countries and start trying to implement distributed generation rather than go large scale to begin with? Is it too expensive right now, or is technology getting there?
I mean, I actually think developing countries are in a really great position because the truth is that Kenya would love to build this huge coal plant on the coast, but they're going to need to build a port. They're going to need to build all the infrastructure to burn the coal in the plant and then get the transmission line. And not only is that going to take a lot of time and money, but it's not, most developing countries don't have that capital. And so what they can afford, as we've seen, is incremental investments in a new diesel plant or a leased diesel plant. And so if instead it was an incremental investment in something like solar or a micro hydro plant, or it doesn't have to be solar because it's not for everyone, but some kind of different technology like that, which are now becoming more feasible and more operational, I think developing countries are in a really great position to capitalize on that.
I have two really quick questions.
Sure.
One is, do you know who built the solar plants in Rwanda? Was that the government or foreign investment? And when you said you were in the Peace Corps and you had the 60-watt panel and you could see it at night, I don't know anything about this. How did that work? Was there like a battery charger that would connect to a lamp?
So the first question, the Rwanda plant, there's a private company, I think it's British, but I'm not sure, that's building it. And they're signing a power purchase agreement with the national utility company, the transmission company, who will pay them some fixed rate for the plant. And our 60-watt panel, we had it hooked up to a battery, and then we had, 3 or 4 lights, and we could charge our phone. And that generally, it lasted every night. Sometimes if we stayed up late, then the lights would kind of flicker. If there was a dust storm, then we'd have to wash off the panel or we wouldn't get a good charge. But it was normally fine.
So it's a Dutch company who is funding that, so it's definitely some foreign direct investment.
Is it World Bank back?
I don't know that. Probably.
Do you come across any opportunities or challenges in the supply chain for distributed generation solution? So apart from the value, how do you get these out there? And what was your experience like with acquiring your own setup?
So for us, we took over from some volunteers who lived there before us, and they had the panel, so we just got it from them. But there were solar panels in our village at the market. There were batteries in the village. We bought the lights. I mean, you could get all of that stuff. The quality, you kind of have to be careful with that. But it was available. And I think we have these programs like Lighting Africa with the World Bank who are trying to do more kind of quality control and help with those markets. Did you have a question?
I think one comment and then a question, and then we should probably, if there's anyone else. I mean, it sounds like, and tell me from right here, that there's a huge opportunity potentially for like a present value for off-grid distributed systems and potentially microgrid systems could be a potential takeaway if you're kind of looking at economic value. And then to get to the other side, I think of this group, could you say more about what you think needs to be in place for development to really happen, particularly as it relates to solar in a Kenyan context? What else
like
do you...
market development?
So if Kenya was to move forward with a PV plant, we've talked about sort of the technical capacity about it. But in your conversations with people at the World Bank, and you're talking to people, they're inputting, they're thinking about solar because Rwanda did it or another country did it. So what would you say to this question of how development can happen, if you can, just from your work, if that makes any sense?
I think some of the key issues lie in the fact that the generating utility and the planning, they're still quasi-government owned. So one of them is 80% owned by the government. The transmission company is 51% owned by the government. And so when the government says that they want to build a nuclear plant, the engineers don't really think this is going to happen, but they have to include it in their national plans. And so you kind of have this huge political influence that hurts your planning. But also, as I mentioned earlier, the idea of manipulating the hydros to accommodate solar might face public opposition because 2 or 3 years ago there was a big drought, and so the hydro levels were way down, and I think tariffs went up like 40%. They went up a lot. So if tariffs are high, or if people think they're paying too much, and they see that, well, you're holding back hydro and you don't have to, there could be public backlash to that. And so, I mean, I don't really know how the best way to address that is. But I think those could be some barriers, is how you balance that.
Okay, I was just going to add on to that. That with an experience from Nigeria, so there's always a trade-off between cost and between reliability. So, for example, using another industry, telecommunication in Nigeria a couple of years ago, the state-controlled company, service was really poor. So Nigerians got frustrated and they were willing to accept whatever was going to be reliable. So it's a huge cost when the new companies came to be private, but people were willing to do it. So it's the same thing with power now. I mean, if some newer solution comes in, it's a little bit more expensive or pricey, but if it's going to be reliable, it's still way cheaper than burning diesel, for example, in your market. So
yeah, when Nigeria tried to get rid of their fuel subsidies, you were right. That lasted like 3 days. Yeah.
I mean, it's an interesting point, because if this is investment constrained, and you can find a new pool of investment, individual people who want to buy panels, then the question is the value of solar below their willingness to pay, not the value to the grid, which is probably lower. I mean, if you think about the value of having electricity, it's way higher than what you actually pay.
Sure.
So, and even where individuals are constrained in terms of their budgets, it's likely to be much higher. So that again kind of makes the case for small DG. Potentially being able to add on incremental capacity. They should still do this to get as much grid connected capacity as they can, but if you can tap into lots of extra dollars that way, you can expand even faster.
And then it's just you kind of have to tweak regulatory issues to accommodate that.
So Kenny, with the final question, and then we'll wrap up.
Curious, the PV plant in South Africa, is it price competitive with the coal?
With the coal?
Yes. So
they're getting, so South Africa did the same thing as India, and they did kind of the reverse bids. So the plant kind of said, here's what we can build for, and they're getting 19.8 cents a kilowatt hour. Coal? I mean, South Africa owns the coal, so it's, I don't know what is coal about.
Interesting stuff to learn.
Yeah, Eskom, I mean, coal is already cheaper to begin with, and then Eskom buys it at a discounted rate because they probably partially own the mines.
Okay, thank you guys. Thank you, Amy. One more time. Okay, so there's about 5 more minutes left. Please introduce yourself to people, talk to people, find out what people are working